I really like the idea that here we want to dive deeper into how we move into action, but anyway, still provide inspiration at the beginning. And I'm happy to open up the discussion on the idea of regeneration as one of the inspirational, concepts that should pave the way for, living, working, managing, and everything else on this finite planet. So, I would like to give an overview at the beginning, starting with why we need to think of these ideas such as regeneration and go beyond sustainability, and then take it over into how can we think this and do this in the context of business. We will continue with this later on with my colleagues here on the panel discussion, so please stay for the panel discussion as well, because we will dive deeper into specific practices. I would like to start with a couple of quotes. I collected 7 quotes which should show you at the beginning a little bit the context in which we are, embedding this discussion. I will not describe the context at the beginning, so please just listen carefully and let your imagination flow. All right? 7 quotes. 2 regarding a problem. The environment, natural resources, and life support systems of our planet have continued to deteriorate, while global risks, like those of climate change, have become more immediate and acute. And some of the world's most precious resources and ecosystems are in acute danger. Why? So, diagnosis. 1. An economic system that takes no account of ecological costs or damage. One which views unfettered growth as progress. 2. Due to patterns of production and consumptions that are undermining the Earth's life support systems. 3. Our very success is leading us to a dangerous future. Solution? 1. Sustainable development is the only viable pathway to a more secure and hopeful future for rich and poor alike. Fortunately, that pathway is still an option, but that option is closing. Why am I reading these quotes? From when are these quotes? Were they from Tarek Al-Wazir's introduction speech at this year's Impact Festival, or from last year or 2 years ago? Well, hell no. They are from 1992, when I was still a little boy, and many of you as well. Yeah, these were collected from a speech given by Maurice Strong, the UN Secretary General, at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. He opened up that speech with an analysis of our problem, the reasons for the problem, and our solution. And he said, our ecosystems are in danger, climate change is becoming more acute, and that is because our economic system, businesses, do not account for environmental aspects. And that's very important. Sustainability is an option, but only for a limited time. There is a window of opportunity, but that window of opportunity is closing. So what do we say to that 31 years later? Say 31 years later than that. Well, first of all, we say, we've tried to achieve sustainable development since decades, but instead of achieving sustainable development, we achieved quite the contrary. We achieved degeneration, which means we reduced the qualities of our ecosystem each and every year. We did not find a real answer in action to the problems that were described already at the end of the 1980s and 90s, and earlier, of course, leading us today even more than in any other year to a situation in which we are in a planetary overshoot with regard to climate change, biodiversity, fresh water, soil quality, and so on. I don't think that I have to go into detail here. I hope you are all aware. The next question is, why have we failed in the past to become sustainable? Well, one of the biggest reasons is that we hoped for something. We promised something, and that was that we will be able to green our growth, to green our economic development, to decouple economic development from environmental destruction. But if we're honest, we have to say, we didn't. In some countries, with regard to some parameters, we can see a slight decoupling with regard to carbon emissions in some countries. But we have been so slow in the past that what we have to achieve in order to remain within 1.5 degrees, we are still far away from that. No national country on this planet is on track with regard to the objectives of the climate agreement in Paris. The next question is then why? Why that? Why haven't we achieved decoupling and greening our growth? Well, the first thing is, we say we want to be sustainable since years, but we still build our economy on fossil fuels. Last year, we spent more than ever, national countries spent more than ever in subsidies for fossil fuels. 7 trillion euro to make fossil fuels more accessible, cheaper for industries and private households. Second, talk is cheap, but action is difficult. For instance, with regard to the circular economy, right? We talk about that also for a long time, but more or less since 10 years, it's really in, our minds, the circular economy, right? Is your company ready for that? Was asked in the Harvard Business Review in 2013. Well, with regard to talk, many are. With regard to action, many aren't. Lots of initiatives of closing the loop are simply greenwash. How can we measure this? Why do I say that? Well, if we look, for instance, at Denmark, which is very often seen as a front runner for sustainability, they have a circularity gap of 96%, which means that of all the resources used in 1 year in that country, only 4% have been there before. They are reused, recycled, and so on. Everything else is virgin material. So a big gap. The next, and that's the final step of my analysis, and then I move over to what we learned for that, but I think that's important to really have this in mind, is that we understood a couple of things as two, low-hanging fruits, particularly to become climate neutral as a company. Lots of companies are climate neutral. Well, they claim they are, through offsetting, of course, preventing very, very often climate action within companies, which does not mean that all climate offsets are useless, but it's a question of how they are achieved. Last year, The Guardian uncovered that 90% of the offsets emitted, or carbon credits emitted by Vera, are useless. So no reduction of emissions actually took place. And that is also because lots of initiatives simply do low-budget tree plantings in monocultures, very often with species from other regions which do not fit into the biodiversity where they are put in. And with this, all the other problems that I have just mentioned at the beginning when I talked about the planetary boundaries, such as freshwater, biodiversity, are not solved. Quite the contrary. And again, even despite the fact that, of course, restoring natural forests is very, very useful, very, very important, but it's a question of the how. So this leads me to the next part. Sustainability was what we wanted. We achieved degeneration. Now we need urgently regeneration. And those who are already familiar with the concept, you, of course, know this graph. But those who don't, just a tiny little description. What most companies do, or what they claim what they do when they say that they are sustainable, they are actually more sustainable than the conventional solution. So they have a lower negative impact on the environment, but they still have a negative impact on the environment. So they are not sustainable. They are still degenerative. So sustainability would then mean net zero to really do no additional harm to an ecosystem. But what we need due to, already our planetary overshoot are lots of initiatives, lots of companies, lots of activities that restore and regenerate what has been, destroyed and reduced in quality beforehand, in order to create planetary and human well-being on this planet. If we do business as usual, we will destroy our wealth. So we need to move away from that. And here it's really important to distinguish between preserving activities, which are in some areas our action field, and in others, restoration and regeneration activities. Just, for me at least, a bit of funny and good example, buffaloes. Today we have 2% of the historical numbers. So is it then enough to preserve that? And they have a high important value for biodiversity? Maybe not. Okay, Now, we want to talk about business, right? So what should business do in order to approach this, in order to move into that direction? Well, the first thing is to work on and to modify the worldview, the perspective. We need to move into a living system thinking. What do I mean with that? I mean with that, very often and usually, we understand humans as something separated from nature, and therefore also businesses as something separated from nature. Resources are just externalities. Effects are just externalities. But we need to move in a direction in which we see our interactions with nature, but also with other stakeholders as entanglements. So we are, as organizations, embedded in nature. We are part of nature. And with this view, we need to look at the specific socio-ecological systems that we are embedded in and that we affect with our entrepreneurial action. What do I mean with that? Well, at all the places that we negatively and potentially positively impact along the value chain, and go into a joint transformation process with the stakeholders, so with the people, organizations, companies, suppliers, and so on, that play a role for our businesses and that we affect with our activities. And with this focus and with this attention, modify our business model with an understanding of a long-term perspective, long-term resilience, a system-based perspective, so looking at the interrelationships between carbon, biodiversity, freshwater, health, well-being, and so on. Third, place-based. What does this place-based mean? It means, imagine, for instance, you use palm oil in your value chain coming from Indonesia and having negative impacts there. Is it then enough to do a biodiversity activity in Brazil? Well, you could become net negative or even net positive if you do a wonderful project in Brazil, right? But you negatively affect still this specific ecosystem. And that's what needs to be changed. At the specific place of your entrepreneurial action, you need to become net positive. Your action needs to become net positive. And that jointly in a co-creative process and a learning process. There are already some nice patterns, blueprints, and so on that are described. But do they fit for every solution? Well, hell no. You need to go into that process with your partners, with other stakeholders, and continuously reflect them. Just a tiny little example to describe what that means, especially that place focus. Last year I was at the Impact Stage together with the CEO of Wildling, who produce shoes. And for their winter shoes, they use wool. And they decided not to use wool from the world market, but instead establish a specific project, a specific collaboration in the value chain to obtain wool from a German local farmer at the north coast of Germany, using a specific breed of sheep that, well, fit perfectly for dike protection, landscape protection over there, but which have a problem. They are gray and they are not used usually in the textile industry. But by using it and explaining to the customers why the wool has a specific color, it is not colored. Well, this created net positive value specifically at that place and reducing negative impact somewhere else. Yeah? And that shows, well, that's work, of course. It's something more than at the end at one activity, one key activity in your business model, which is called buy offset. Then you don't change the logic of your business model. I have 3 final comments. And with this, hopefully open up already our discussion, our panel discussion. The first one is, I think it becomes clear being regenerative, becoming regenerative is not easy and requires deep transformation. Last year, a couple of startups came to me and asked me, hey, can I have some advice? We want to turn our business model towards regeneration. Can you tell me 1, 2 tiny little things? And that's, of course, not enough. It needs to go very deep. It's not only the business model, but the structures and patterns below that, behaviors, mindsets, anxieties, and so on. The second aspect is we need to spread the news, of course, spread this concept, go into conversations and convince large corporations, mid-sized corporations, and so on. But we have to protect the core of the terminology. If we say something is regenerative because there is some positive impact in the value chain, that's not regenerative. Yeah? So to protect this terminology. And now my final comment, at the same time, other companies tell me, well, Stephan, that's pretty difficult to do. it's pretty difficult to do. It's complex. Well, the answer is yes. We need to embrace that complexity. But of course, we need to balance an internal and external regenerativity. We don't need martyrs for a good cause which burn out their employees, in order to be externally regenerative. We need to also do good internally. And that's, of course, difficult. And I hope that we can talk about that also in our panel discussion. And with this, thank you for your attention. Thanks.